And if you are looking to learn more about how to develop proficiency skills using your local curriculum, you're in the right spot. So I would like to get started by just doing a little sharing about your goals for today. And we are hoping to show you how to make a proficiency scale using your local curriculum. And we're also going to provide you a template and then some specifics to allow you to use your local curriculum to create a scale with some examples. So as we get started, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Curriculum Leadership Institute. My name is Stacey Bruton, and I am a consultant with CLI, and I am your host for today. Curriculum Leadership Institute is based in Kansas, but we actually work all over the United States. And so we have a model for school improvement, and our model has 3 areas. We call this visual or triangle. We focus on curriculum development, instruction, and also assessment. The very center of our model is a governance piece, and I'll explain a little bit more about that when I tell you what it is that CLI does. We're a nonprofit organization. We're based in Kansas, and we were founded by Dr. Stu Irve in 1991. So we've been around for a while. We partner with school districts to guide them through developing a process to implement curriculum instruction and assessment. And we are a systems approach. And so our goal is to provide the tools for a district to customize. And we are flexible to allow that district to make our processes and systems work for them. We provide professional development along the way, so leadership capacity is built within the district. And so our hope is to work ourselves out of a job. But as that district is making some decisions in regards to academics, they will create documents that provide the evidence and data required to meet accreditation mandates. So that's just a little bit of an overview about CLI. I would like you to think about, what is curriculum? What does curriculum mean to you? Our definition at CLI is that curriculum is an organized, teachable unit made up of local learning targets aligned vertically across all grade levels and content, and also aligned to standards. So curriculum itself is not standards. It's not the resource. It's kind of the in-between. So at this time, I'm going to drop a folder in the chat, and you should have access to this folder. That folder will provide some useful information throughout this webinar. And one of the important pieces is a glossary. I may use some terms that you may not quite be familiar with. And so that glossary will be kind of a quick view to define some of those terms. So as we move forward, part of our process, and actually one of the first steps after we establish our governance group, is to start working with the content area to develop local curriculum. And in that piece, we work with teachers, find out what they're already teaching. We look at external references, specifically the state standards, and then we do an alignment PK-12 to make sure that an item is included, we have scaffolding that takes place, and that we don't have any redundancies. So we break down, sometimes we do some clarification of standards, but we also put some pieces in place that are important to build up to that standard, which is the bar. After we develop that local curriculum, you should be able to answer the PLC question, what is it that we want students to know? Because our curriculum will have learning targets that are measurable. So thinking about the glossary that's been dropped in the support documents folder, there's some CLI terminology that I'm going to use throughout the rest of this webinar that I'd like you to be familiar with. And that way I'm not talking in another language to you. So the CLI terminology is in the glossary, but some key points that we're going to focus on would be curriculum, outcome, component, proficiency, and standard. So we've already mentioned curriculum, but I would like to explain to you what an outcome means to us at CLI. An outcome is the summary statement of a unit of instruction. And so putting all of those skills together in measurable terms, it's high achievement, it has the rigor, and it's the expectation of what it is we want students to know and be able to do. A component is the specific learning target that's a part of the outcome itself. And so it is a piece that we check formatively, but it's also aligned to a standard. Proficiency is the level of student learning that we are trying to get the students to achieve. It's where we want them to perform. And so our proficiency scale is based on those learning targets. And so we know a student is proficient when they can achieve those learning targets. And then finally, a standard. A standard is a recommendation from the State Department. I like to just shorten that by saying this is the bar of where students need to achieve. Now, how they get there would be the curriculum. So how this all fits together is a good example would be this ELA sample from one of our districts. It's an outcome. The outcome is in bold. That's the summary statement. And then the components are the targets underneath. So putting this, some of those terms with this example, you can see that we have the outcome in bold. We have the outcome code to the left. We have the components that are listed below the outcome. We have standards at the very end to show the alignment. And we also have some of those components without standards. That's absolutely okay. So some of those components do not have standards because it's been determined locally that that is important for the progression of learning. You will also see that some of those standards have different subcategories from ELA, and that's the intent. No one expected standards to be taught alone in isolation and without connections. And so when we create our local curriculum, those standards are blended together for a nice teachable unit. So I want to spend just a moment on the left side of this sample. We have local codes that we encourage a district to develop on their own to allow teachers to communicate about the learning targets. So those local codes are on the left. Usually we use an abbreviation from the content area, the grade level, and then we just do simple numbering in sequential order. So this one, language arts, 5th grade, first outcome. And so a teacher can communicate in their PLC, how are your students doing on LA 514? So that's why we create our own learning target goals. So as we move forward, how does this all connect to a proficiency scale? First of all, the curriculum needs to be developed. And then during the validation year, which means when you try it out to see if this is really what you're intending for student learning, we also design assessments to check student progress of that curriculum. And so in our assessment piece, we recommend the first step is to develop your proficiency scale. So that's how the local curriculum connects to proficiency scales and assessments. You are measuring those learning targets. And so by creating that proficiency scale, it allows you to prioritize your curriculum and standards, and then you can narrow the focus of your learning targets. By creating the assessments, you're able to answer the PLC question, how will we know if our students are learning? So it all connects together nicely. So now as we move forward, let's talk a little bit about what is a proficiency scale. A proficiency scale is typically a 4-point scale. It identifies a curricular target and related skills, which are intended to clarify a progression of learning. So that just sounds like a pretty detailed definition, but in actuality, our proficiency scales allow us to find out where our students are, and it also allows us to measure student growth. This is an example of a proficiency scale, and I'm hoping you're able to see this okay. If not, I have a couple of examples in that support document folder. So this is an example of a scale from a school district that I work with outside of Chicago. It's a small K-8 school called Penoyer, and they've been very successful in their implementation of curriculum, instruction, assessment, proficiency scales, and also standards-based grading, which is something I'll mention later. So this proficiency scale is actually a 4-point scale, and it has not only numbers, but it also has a descriptor for that level. And so in this case, a level 4 is advanced, level 3 is considered mastery, that's the target, a level 2 is approaching, and a level 1 is emerging. So looking at that scale, it should make sense to not only the teachers that are using the scales to evaluate students, but it also should make sense to the students and the parents because the targets are visible and the progression of student learning is clear. So how do you make a proficiency scale? And why would we use it? Well, it provides clear identification of the learning targets. It helps focus the assessment around the targets. It allows opportunities to show students feedback and growth. And then it connects the performance to an evidence-based reporting system. Sometimes a district will want to utilize standards-based reporting, evidence-based reporting, but they have a point system and percentages. And it's just really difficult to transfer that 4, 3, 2, 1 to points and percentages because it just doesn't equal out. So this provides you that tool to simplify that reporting. So our local curriculum features on a proficiency scale include the outcome and components. And so this one, once again, is Penoyer's. And so I'm going to spend just a little bit of time using the unit from 3rd grade science to show you where each of the pieces of that unit fit on the scale. We start by selecting a unit of instruction, and in this case, it's 3rd grade science, and it's about the effects of force on the motion of objects. And so we take pieces of that unit, meaning the outcome, the components, and even the vocabulary, and those go into developing our scale. So we start with, well, before I start, I'm just going to give you just kind of an outline of what each section represents. We have a title, and that way all of these scales are the same template for every content area. So it's important to have a title, grade level, and content. And then we also state this is for outcome 3. It's for science, 3rd grade, outcome 3. And then we put the actual outcome wording in this heading. So the level 4 is above and beyond the expectation. It is not a part of the curriculum, but it's a jump in rigor to show that the students are advanced above the curriculum and the target. The level 3 is the target of the unit. The level 2 would be prerequisites to the target and also the vocabulary. And a level 1 includes with help. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the level 1 and what that means for students who have IEP and 504 plans. And then finally, some of the components that are lesser in priority are not on the proficiency scale, but we list those at the very bottom. That way we know we don't forget about them and we need to make sure we check them formatively. So the steps of getting started would be to start by taking your unit. And so in your support documents folder, there is a unit, and it should show the outcome from third grade science. Then we'll identify priorities in the unit, and then we'll map those priorities out on the scale. So that's how we'll get started. Take the unit, third grade science, note the local codes on the left. We're going to communicate and record those on the scale. And then the standards for alignment are on the right, and they're found in the right column. And you'll notice that those are next generation science standard codes. So to identify priorities in the curriculum, because we all know that with all of the standards that are expected at each grade level, it is difficult to provide the time, the same amount of time for each standard for instruction and assessment. And so by creating your local curriculum, it allows you to narrow that down and put your focus on the pacing guide for the amount of time you want to spend. So a pacing guide is just a plan to instruct the curriculum throughout the whole year, and it allows you to determine, I'm going to spend 2 days on this component. I'm going to spend a week on this component. I'm going to spend 2 weeks on this outcome unit. And it's just planning for instruction throughout the whole year. That's on your glossary if you have a question. So identifying priorities in the curriculum, you find the target of the outcome unit. In this case, this district determined that the target and the priority was the fourth component. And so the fourth component is the level 3. That's the target. So we just copy and paste that component and put it in the 3 spot. So the next step is to determine if there are any components in the curriculum that don't relate totally to the target. Sometimes we have standards that we are expected to teach, but they don't really fit the target of the unit, and you have to place them in the unit anyway for instruction and formative assessment. So in this case, we have 2 components that don't really fit the target completely. We take those codes and we put them down at the very bottom as a reminder that we'll check those formatively. So we still teach those components, we still check them, we just don't put them on our proficiency scale to measure the progress. And then our next step is to look at the remaining components, and those that are remaining should be your level 2s. Those are considered supporting components. So those would go in the level 2 spot on the proficiency scale. Also, we have some key vocabulary, and we all know that vocabulary instruction is critical for the success of students across all content areas. So we really wanted to emphasize vocabulary. Vocabulary is in the level 2, and we just put that in that level because we will communicate with students throughout our instruction. We'll use those vocabulary terms during our assessment, and they need to be familiar with them in order to be successful. Finally, what is a 1 on the proficiency scale? A 1 is when a student can achieve partial or may have very little success, even with help at the level 2 and 3 content. So earlier I mentioned, what do we do for students who have an IEP or a 504? Those students have accommodations which may require them to have assistance. And because of those accommodations, those students can still achieve a level 2 or even a level 3. Because they have those accommodations, I have had some teachers ask me, well, they're getting help, so they can never achieve over a 1. That's incorrect because they have an IEP or a 504. They can achieve a 3 based on those accommodations. If you instruct with those accommodations, you must assess with those accommodations. So anyway, a level 1 is when a student who doesn't have an IEP or 504 receives some help and they still are not completely successful. So then our next step is the 4. And as a teacher of the model, just a little background, my district adopted the CLI model when I was a first-year teacher, So I grew up professionally using the CLI process, and then I became a consultant many years later. But my experience with coming up with a level 4 was pretty challenging because I was a fairly new teacher. I didn't have a lot of professional experience under my belt. And so I wasn't quite for sure how I would come up with advanced. I didn't have enough teaching experience to develop an advanced score. And so someone had explained it to me that a level 4 is truly what the level 3 is, but a real life application. And that was very helpful for me. A level 4 can also be a bump up in rigor or maybe some additional content, but it is above and beyond the curricular expectation. Sometimes a teacher will look at the next grade level to get some ideas of what is expected. For example, if you're developing a 3rd grade level 4 descriptor, it might be helpful to look at the 4th grade curriculum for the expectation. It's above and beyond what the 3rd grade curriculum would be. So as we look at our local curriculum, we map out the priorities on the scale. This is just the same slide that you saw earlier, but it just kind of goes into what you would find at each level. And this is also in your support document folder. So connections that are made as a result of the proficiency scale. First of all, everything is so related. If you determine the level that you consider proficient, which is your level 3, that helps you with your evidence-based grading. So it helps with your grading practices. It also helps with your reporting because you don't have to do any type of conversion from points to percentages to descriptors. It's already there for you. And there are programs out there that provide help with that, on how to do that. So finally, if you're thinking, okay, so I have standards, I have a resource, but I don't have a local curriculum. Something that we can help you with is coming up with your own local curriculum. And we have a workshop that's coming up pretty soon that could help you and provide you the assistance. It's developing your local curriculum. We have a 2-part session or two-hour sessions, and we start on February 14th, and then there's another one on the 28th. If you're interested in learning more about how to create your local curriculum, you can follow the link on your support document, and it will take you to our website, and there's a sign up through Eventbrite. Also, it's interesting that Ed Week had an article out last fall on how more districts are designing their own curriculum. And so studies show that even though a district may actually buy a text series or a resource that's aligned to standards, that doesn't always fit with the local school district. And so teachers end up modifying that resource. And if you create your own curriculum from the start, you can utilize that resource as support. But by having a local curriculum adopted by the entire district will ensure that all students across all of the grade levels in that district will have alignment and will receive the skills that they need in order to be successful, grade level to grade level. So that's our workshop that we have coming up. If you go to cliweb.org, you can select service options, and then I just have a little clip there that shows you what that looks like if you're interested. So at this time, you should also find an example of a CLI proficiency scale, and we did adapt this from developing and using proficiency scales in the classroom. It's a Marzano resource. We did some adaptation on this to make this work for us in our districts. I want to give some credit there. You can use this proficiency scale template. You should just make a copy and then use this for your own district. So follow that link to make that copy. And then there's also a reminder on that same document for how this all fits together. So determine the target of the unit, identify any components that don't directly relate to the target, determine the prerequisites, list vocabulary in the level 2 as well, and then create a real life 4, which is beyond the expectation. So if you're interested in seeing another reminder on how to do all this, this is a shortened, kind of a condensed version. It's a unit from one of our CLI districts. This one happens to be Park 6 in Cody, Wyoming. And so this district has actually created a proficiency scale using this outcome from computer science. And this happens to be at the kindergarten level. So the way that our outcome components are identified here, this layout represents the bold is the outcome, followed by the components underneath. Just as a reminder, our local codes are on the left. So our outcome code is up here, right below computing systems. Our component codes are listed in sequential order, and we have 3 for this unit. And then the standards from the Wyoming state standards are in parentheses at the very end. So as we look at this particular outcome unit, we have a proficiency scale. The 3 is actually going to be the outcome itself this time. The summary statement, the outcome, is actually the target. So we would put the outcome in the level 3, and then we find any components if we have some that don't relate to the target. And in this case, all of the components relate to the target. So all will go on the scale. So components 1, 2, and 3 will be copied and pasted on the scale. Those are the level 2s. In order for a student to be successful at the 3, they have to be successful at all of the targets in the level 2. And so using those learning targets, this district came up with the key vocabulary that they use to communicate and instruct and assess. And those are listed right below. And then the level 4, which is above and beyond the curriculum, that was developed by the teachers. It's not a part of the curriculum. And so what would an advanced student look like? Providing assistance in kindergarten. That could be quite interesting to see those students helping each other at kindergarten, but that definitely is a step up in rigor, and that is real life. So once again, the level 1 is nothing as part of the curriculum, but it's a student that's getting assistance and still isn't quite successful. And we do not have any components assessed formatively that are not a part of the scale. So here are some tips from the CLI Ninjas. We recommend using your local curriculum that has measurable learning targets. Verbs are important. Some of our districts use Webb's depth of knowledge, and some use Bloom's taxonomy. But we need to have measurable verbs. Sometimes standards do not have measurable verbs that are clearly identifying what the students will know and be able to do. So that's pretty important, and it's a huge part of our process of local curriculum development. Then develop your proficiency scale before creating your local assessments. Develop that first because that helps you identify how many questions you need for each level and what those questions are going to be. So I have a couple of Q&As that I'm going to share with you. These are some questions that we get asked. Why don't you just make proficiency scales from the standards? I'm hoping you're able to see this okay. The standards are not in teachable units of instruction. And so there are so many of them. We don't just teach one standard in isolation. We blend them together in a teachable unit. You can still determine how a student is performing on individual standards because you're still checking all of the targets formatively. And Another reason that we don't make the scales from the standards is because we often will create our own local learning targets. We create bits and pieces of a local curriculum instead of just adopting a text. And then our proficiency scales are aligned to those local targets, which in turn are aligned to standards. We just feel like we get a better picture of how the students are progressing in a unit, and they're not just pieced together. Who benefits from proficiency scales? First of all, the students do. They're instructed and assessed over the learning targets. Each level is clearly identified so students know what is expected. The parents also have clear expectations, and those that are engaged can monitor that progress and see the gains from their students. And then, of course, the teachers, because the teachers have clearly identified learning targets. They're aligned to performance levels. The instruction can be aligned to those targets, and they have priorities that are determined, and lesser priorities are also identified. So one thing that I didn't mention earlier was, how do you know what the priority is? Sometimes a state department will identify priorities like these are the most important standards for our state. Sometimes a district will identify priorities if they see students are underperforming in a certain grade level. They determine local priorities too. And so that helps teachers guide what the target is on the proficiency scale. And then also teachers have a more simplified way to transfer student learning to evidence-based reporting. It's more accurate than any type of translation that they have to go through, or using percentages or points. So I know that we're getting close to the end of time. I would like to give you some opportunities to ask questions, but for those of you that may have to cut out a little early, my email and my phone number are on this slide. I do appreciate your attendance today. I thank you for your time. I hope you found some value in this free webinar, and I hope that you can use the template to create your own scale. So the steps, once again, are on the support document handouts. If you're interested in maybe learning a little bit more about CLI and how your district can utilize the CLI model to lead curriculum efforts, we do have a Curriculum Ninja Mastermind group that meets a couple times a month. We have a link that is on our website if you're interested in signing up for that. It also allows you to set professional goals, and also it allows you to maybe ask some questions about how you can pursue curriculum efforts in your district. And so districts that we work with have an advantage right now because there's been some ESSER money for professional development that they've utilized to pay for some of these services. And so if you're wondering, you know, our budgets are tight, that would be an opportunity for you to get some additional help and not utilize what you've already earmarked some funds for. All right. Well, I appreciate the time that you took to learn a little bit more about developing proficiency skills and also learning more about CLI.